This has 36 disturbing true crime stories, and I'll be reading the next story from the first time I read it. And if you're interested in that video, I will leave that link below. And also, once I will be finishing this book, hopefully by the end of this year, well, definitely. Once I'm finished, I will be sending it to a subscriber. And if you want me to sign it, I will. I mean, I'm nobody important, but if you would like so, I don't mind. And you can read it or just look through it or whatever you see fit. So, go ahead and sit back, relax, grab a snack, get nice and comfy, and enjoy some crime time. Warning, this content is for educational purposes only. Some viewers might find this disturbing. Parental discretion is advised. Today's story will be called Bloodthirsty Parole. So let's get into it. Anyone who has driven the 180-mile stretch of Interstate 5 from Portland, Oregon to Seattle, Washington possibly remembers the small town of Centralia, Washington. Not because it's of particularly any historical importance, though it has plenty of history, but mostly it's because it's the halfway point between Portland and Seattle, and a convenient place to stop for gas or to grab some food. In 1977, Centralia was a town of only 10,000 residents, and neighboring Charlie's and only had about 5,000. Together, they were known as the Twin Cities. It was a beautiful rural area surrounded by miles and miles of dense forest in every direction. The story of the murder of 13-year-old Bruce Kim is almost entirely absent on the internet. On the evening of New Year's Day in 1977, Bruce Kim attended a house party at number 7 in the Lamac Apartments, an old, rundown apartment building near the railroad tracks at the north end of town. The resident of apartment number 7 was an older man who was known to have parties to which anyone could come, drink, party, or buy some weed or LSD, regardless of age. Yikes. On New Year's Day, friends had seen Bruce riding his bicycle on the streets of Centralia. But that evening, he did not return home after the party. The next morning, Bruce's mother, Joan, called the Centralia police. Quote, "He has never stayed out overnight without calling me. He wouldn't have gone away willingly," end quote. Bruce's bicycle was in the front of their house at 1002 L Street, but he was nowhere to be found. Bruce was small for his age and had long, reddish brown hair. The last anyone had seen him, he was wearing blue jeans, a jean jacket, and a printed t-shirt. There were no clothes missing from closet. He had very little money to his name, so police ruled out the chance that he had to simply run away from home. Local detectives immediately contacted Bruce's closest friends to try to backtrack his last known events. That's when they found out that he had attended the party in the Lamech apartments. Detectives spoke to the resident of the apartment, who gave police a list of attendees of the party as best as he could remember. They then spent the next few days tracking down the attendees and questioning them one by one. Unfortunately, the apartment was a known drug den, and most of the partygoers that attended weren't too excited to speak to police. The interviews uncovered no new clues in tracking down the boy. Just before midnight on January 6, a man ran to the Centralia Fire Department and pounded on the locked doors. Oh my God. It was late and nobody was answering. He had run 6 blocks from the Lamech apartments, which was engulfed in flames. Frustrated, he ran another 3 blocks to the police department, who then alerted the fire department. By the time fire trucks arrived at the Lamech apartments, it was too late. By morning, the building was nothing but charred black sticks and rubble. When the fire marshal assessed the damage, at first glance it seemed clean. There was no evidence of accelerants. The building was very old and had archaic wiring, so the chance of the cause of the fire being faulty wiring was high, but intuition told him it was way more than that. He suspected an experienced arsonist. When the fire marshal heard that the building was the last place Bruce Kim was seen alive, it only solidified his suspicions. The cause of fire was initially determined to be inconclusive. Centralia detectives told reporters, quote, "If Bruce Kim's body had been in the apartment, there would have been some evidence of his remains in the fire debris. Fragments of bone, something. It is extremely rare for a body to be completely destroyed in a fire, even Holocaust as fully involved as that of the Lamech." End quote. As the days passed, police grew frustrated at the lack of clues, but on January 13th, their luck turned. A woman named Susan Ragan called the county sheriff and told him she had something to show him. The woman told him that Bruce Kim was most likely dead and showed him a pair of blue jeans that her brother had left with her. The cuffs of jeans were stained with what appeared to be blood. She was holding the jeans for her brother, and she was clearly terrified. The lead investigator recalled, quote, "She says Tommy brought her the jeans and told her he'd gotten the stains on the cuff when he turned a body over with his foot." End quote. Susan Ragan was the sister of 33-year-old Tommy Ragan, a name that was well known to the Centralia Police and Lewis County Sheriff. Tommy's conflicts with police dated back to his teenage years. Even as a teenager, Tommy Ragan was in trouble with the law. At 15 years old, Ragan had stolen a car and was confined to the Green Hill School, Washington's maximum security lockdown for older juveniles. One night, Ragan and another inmate broke out of the school, stole a 1.5-ton vehicle, and went on a rampage. The two went the wrong way up the highway, crashing through a police barricade, ramming 6 other cars, and almost running over a police officer. And why was he ever released after doing all of that? I swear, the justice system sucks. They led police on a 45-mile high-speed pursuit before they were finally stopped. And y'all let somebody like this back out. Over the next 17 years, Ragan spent more time in prison than out, with charges ranging from burglary, larceny, and car theft to the R word and kidnapping. The worst of his offenses was when he was 20 years old. Ragan was charged with kidnapping a 14-year-old boy named Bobby at knife point. Ragan approached 2 young boys after a baseball game in Fort Worth Park and asked for help to push his car. When they started pushing, Ragan pulled a switchblade knife on them. One boy ran away, but Ragan grabbed Bobby and dragged him into the forest, cutting him several times in the ribs with the knife. Once in the forest, he sodomized the boy and dragged him across the Skookamachuck River. The boy that got away had alerted police, and Bobby was able to get away when Ragan was distracted by police sirens. So at least they both got away, even though the other one was injured. At least he was still alive. And he probably wasn't even still locked up. At the time, Ragan was only charged with kidnapping. But years later, the boy confided the entire story to police, that he was orally and anally R-word by Ragan at the knife point. Coincidentally, Bobby went to be one of Centralia's few celebrities, playing Major League Baseball for 5 years. Okay. At the time of Bruce Kim's disappearance, Tommy Ragan was out on parole. His address at the time was 90 miles away in Seattle, but he had been visiting family in Centralia. Ragan had also been an attendee at the party in the Lamech apartments. Yep, he did it. Case closed. In fact, police had questioned him in the days after. Detectives were very keen to question him further, since they had the additional information about the bloody jeans. Detectives needed to find Tommy Ragan. According to his parole officer in Seattle, he was living with someone named Christina Kempf. Christina's past was every bit as sordid as Ragan's. She was actually born Charles Wheeler. At an early age, he realized that he had a boy's body, but identified as a girl. Quote, "All I knew was I wanted to be a girl, and I wasn't," end quote. In his teens, Charles assumed he was just gay. He was married at 16, but was divorced by 21. Quote, "The homosexual life was a disappointment. I wanted to talk love and marriage, pots and pans, and they wanted to talk sex. diagnosis of incipient schizophrenia. Upon release from the hospital, Charles decided to become Christine. She changed her name and started wearing women's clothes and makeup. She desperately wanted to make it official by getting a sex change, but she lacked the funds for the expensive procedure. It wasn't long before Christina was arrested and sentenced to 20 years in prison for cashing stolen checks, but was released after only 3 years. Within 20 days of her release, she was arrested again, this time for murder. According to Christina, she was accosted in the parking lot of a grocery store by a man that was trying to force her to have sex. During the altercation, she stabbed the man to death. Christina was sentenced to life in prison in the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, a men's prison. Identifying as a woman, she was harassed in prison and ridiculed for being a cross-dresser. Prison psychologists criticized her, telling her that she was just homosexual. Though she was sentenced to life in prison, she was released in 1973. Upon her release, an anonymous donor had sent her $1,000 to start a fund to help her pay for a sex change. The anonymous donor ended up being an odd, flamboyant church in Seattle. The donation wasn't enough for a full sex change, so Christina got breast implants and started hormone therapy. In the spring of 1973, Christina had married again, this time to a man named Andy. The wedding took place in a huge mansion on Lake Washington that was the headquarters of the church that gave her the donation. The preacher of the church and owner of the mansion was a large, eccentric man with 40D fake breasts who dressed in flowing silk robes. The church televised their wedding and paid for their honeymoon in Hawaii. The marital bliss didn't last long. Both Christina and Andy were arrested on drug charges and sentenced to prison. They arrested Christina as Charles Wheeler, and she shared a cell with her husband Andy. After only 18 months, Christina was out of prison again and moved into an apartment in Seattle with Tommy Ragan while Andy sat in jail. On January 14th, Centralia detectives were still searching for Tommy Ragan. They had pulled him over in his 1960 green Corvair on January 12th for a traffic violation, but that was before he was wanted for questioning and nobody had seen him since. In addition to the Corvair, Ragan often drove a brown 1965 Barracuda, which belonged to Christina Kempf. Police were on the lookout for both vehicles, but were cautious, knowing that they may be armed. It was rumored that Ragan often carried a sawed-off 22 caliber rifle. The Seattle police were looking for Ragan too. Neither Christina nor Ragan were at their Seattle apartment. The same day, Centralia detectives went back to Ragan's sister's house to see if they could get any more information out of her, and they were in luck. His sister was nothing like her brother. She didn't want any part of him if he had murdered a 14-year-old boy, and told police exactly what Tommy had told her. She told police that Ragan admitted to her he killed Bruce Kim. She said that Tommy told her he had buried the body somewhere near Yelm, Washington, a tiny town about 30 miles northeast of Centralia. The problem was Centralia was surrounded by dense forest, and Yelm was even more so. It would take a miracle to find a grave in such a vast wilderness without more specific information. Centralia police contacted the Yelm police for help. Ragan had some prison buddies in the area that they thought he might stay with, but they hadn't heard from him. When police checked on the status of the 1960 Corvair, they saw that Ragan had just sold it the day before, January 13th, the day after he had been pulled over for a traffic violation. Detectives contacted the new owners of the Corvair and impounded the vehicle. The new owners quickly stopped payment on the check that they wrote to Ragan before he could cash it. Inside the car, they found what looked like bloodstains on the seats. He didn't even clean the seats. And tiny bits of dirt. On the bottom side of the car, they saw that the undercarriage had recently scraped something. Their assumption was that Ragan had bottomed out the car somewhere on an old logging trail in Yelm when he was disposing of the body. That same evening, January 14th, Seattle police found Ragan and took him into custody for break and parole. On the 90-mile drive in the back of a patrol car back down to Centralia, he kept his mouth shut. Ragan's sister was desperately trying to distance herself from her brother. She had very little doubt that her brother had killed the boy, and she called police one more time. When detectives came to her house, she gave them 2 items that Tommy had left with her: a shovel still covered with dirt and a pocket knife. She also had a little more information than she let on the first time. She told detectives that she didn't know the exact location that he had buried him. Quote, "It's supposed to be near the Cougar Mountain area of Yelm. There's an old logging road, a mud hole where you have to turn and go through a fence, a kind of rise in the land as the road's been around. There's trees, just small fir trees," end quote. Police hypothesized that the quote, "rise in the land," end quote, was where Ragan may have bottomed out the Corvair. On the morning of January 16th, a search team of officers scoured the area near Cougar Mountain. The January weather in southwest Washington was notoriously miserable, raining and wet, making old launching roads muddy. The terrain in the Yelm forest was filled with the thick blackberry bushes, vines, and fir trees. Searching a forest so thick and overgrown was almost pointless. And the first day of the search was a failure. Sorry if you can hear my ear in the background, it just turned on. The next day, the crew searched again. This time, they were armed with aerial maps of the area and plaster impressions they had taken from the Corvair tires. At a fork in an old launching road, they came across their first clue, a match in the mud to the Corvair tires. Followed the Corvair tracks, and further up the road found a hump that could have caused the scratch marks on the bottom of the car. Detectives took dirt samples from the road, hoping they could later match it to the dirt found on the underside of the Corvair. Where the tracks seemed to end, police spread out to search the dense forest. Most of the police in the area were also regular deer hunters and had a lot of experience was rummaging through the thick woods. About 100 feet into the forest from the lodging road, one detective noticed a falling tree that had recently been burned. He thought he may be onto something. There were also what seemed to be track marks in the mud near the log. Not far from the log, he noticed a patch of buffalo grass. The grass wasn't planted in the ground though. It seemed as if it had been torn away and was lying on the ground. It was obvious that someone had intended to hide something beneath. The team was called to the site and they dug very lightly, only using their hands. The dirt was fresh and not packed down. Just 6 inches below the surface, they reached flesh. As they pushed the dirt aside, they could tell it was the back and hip of a small person face down. Oh my god. There were what appeared to be slashes and scratches across the back. Oh my god. As they cleared the dirt away from the rest of the body and reached the neck, they realized there was a massive gash, but nothing could prepare them for what they saw next. As they continued to dig, they realized that it wasn't a gash at all. Oh my god. The head had been completely severed. There was no head at all in the grave. I should have saved this one for Freaky Friday. When the decapitated body was pulled out of the shallow grave and laid on the ground, it was clear that someone had tried to dissect the limbs but failed. Other joints were cut but not all the way through. Possibly the killer was unaware just how hard it was to dismember a body. When they rolled the body over onto its back, they were in for another shock. They could tell that the body was male, but the genitals had been severed completely. Additionally, there was a massive gash from the pubic bone up to the chest. Jesus. As the day progressed, investigators painstakingly processed the crime scene, scouring the areas for anything that the killer might have left behind. All they found were some scrapes of toilet paper with a distinctive brown floral print on them. The body was taken back to Centralia and they brought a forensic pathologist up from Portland, Oregon for the post-mortem examination. Although investigators knew this had to be the body of Bruce Kim, they would still need some confirmation of identity. The cold January weather was hopeful as it had minimized decomposition. Wow. Bruce had never been fingerprinted, and since they didn't find a head buried with the body, they couldn't identify him by dental records. Just a year earlier, however, Bruce had suffered a severe leg break. When the body was x-rayed, it showed the break. The break matched with the x-rays on file with the Centralia General Hospital. Oh my god. It was indeed the body of Bruce Kim. During the autopsy, Bruce's blood alcohol level was read at 21%, an impossibly high level for anyone, let alone a 13-year-old boy. Decomposition and the extreme blood loss can alter the reading though, so the pathologist wasn't sure that it was accurate. Tommy Ragan was in lockup for parole violation and he wasn't talking. Investigators then retraced all of his movements since the first of the year. They already knew that he was at the party at the Lamech Apartments. They also learned that he borrowed a shovel from a prison friend of his at 1:30 p.m. on January 3rd, returning it later that evening. They also learned that he had slept in Christina Kemp's Barracuda 1 block from Lamech Apartments on the night of the fire. He had been seen in were several handwritten pages penned by Ragan. It was the story of a homosexual killing involving 2 killers and 1 victim. They also found rolls of toilet paper with a brown floral print, exactly the same as the shreds they found near the gravesite. The search warrant, however, was very specific, and one detective spotted something that could be useful, but legally wasn't included in the warrant. They needed the signature from a superior court judge to get an additional warrant, but it was late at night. That night, they found a judge to sign for a second warrant and went back to the apartment again. The item they wanted was a photo they'd seen in the photo album. One picture in particular showed Ragan staring wide-eyed into the camera, framing his face. On both cheeks were smears of red liquid that looked like blood in the shape of a pentagram. Oh my god, bruh, people are sick. A 5-pointed star pointed downward, often associated with the occult or devil worship. Investigators now question whether Bruce Kim had been murdered as a part of some sort of cult ritual. Another tenant told detectives that Christina had confided in them that Ragan had told her he accidentally hit a young boy with his car, breaking his neck. According to Christina, Ragan panicked and buried the boy. Police knew there was no truth in this story. Bruce's body had no broken bones and no bruising to indicate being hit by a car. Detectives still needed to talk to Christina, but was nowhere to be found. The next obvious person to talk to was the church minister who had conducted her wedding and paid for her breast implants and honeymoon to Hawaii. When police arrived at the church minister's opulent mansion, it was clear they had stumbled into a court of sorts. It seemed that many people lived at the mansion with dramatic artwork, 2-inch thick shag carpet, and a view overlooking Lake Washington. Another thing they noticed right away was that the room they were in was the background in Ragan's pentagram photo. Dang, so the minister had something to do with it too. The picture had been taken there. One of the women at the mansion remembered Ragan and said, maybe this is a typo. One of the women at the mansion remembered Ragan had said she was the person that took the photo of him. She claimed it was all just a joke and painted the pentagram on his face. Ultimately, the residents barely remembered Ragan. They said they hadn't seen Christina in quite some time and had no idea where she might be. In a strange coincidence, there was an article in the Sunday, January 30th edition of the Seattle newspaper about Christina. The article wasn't about the police search for her, but rather a sympathetic piece about the struggles with homosexual and transgender life, featuring photos of her lounging in silk pajamas showing her artificial cleavage. The newspaper had no idea about the search for her and her possible involvement in a horribly sadistic murder. On February 8th, Christina gave up hiding from police and walked into the police station with an attorney. She insisted she had nothing to do with the murder and had no knowledge of it at all, and therefore could give no testimony. But when prosecutors offered her immunity to testify against Ragan, she quickly took it. Tommy Ragan was initially charged with aggravated murder, meaning that a murder was committed in the course of or in furtherance of the crime of the R word or kidnapping. It was the only crime in Washington state punishable with a mandatory death sentence. Prosecutors believed that Bruce had been actually assaulted before he was killed, and the death was an attempt to cover up the crime of the R word. Once Ragan was behind bars, detectives revisited Bobby, the young boy that had been kidnapped by Ragan 13 years earlier. It was then that Bobby broke down and told police of the R word. He told detectives he was severely traumatized and thought of himself as lucky to be alive. Yes, he was extremely lucky. He told detectives that Ragan took him into the woods, tied him up, put the switchblade to his throat, and told him he would cut off his genitals if he wasn't cooperative. Even with Bobby's testimony, prosecutors knew that trying to prove aggravated murder would be a stretch. Wow. When word got to the public that Ragan had been charged, another witness came forward. A man that was at the Lamecca party in the early hours of January 2nd told police that he saw Ragan having sex with Bruce Kim. Though this information didn't, oh my god, ew, a minor, oh my god. Bruh, people are sickening. Sick. Sorry. Oh my god. Oh, that is so fucking disgusting. Though this information didn't suggest the sex was forced and showed nothing to prove that Ragan murdered him, it still helped solidify the case. The trial was set for late April, but just before the start date of the trial, Ragan's attorney told police that he wanted to talk. Ragan and his attorney asked for a deal. Ragan offered to plead guilty to a lesser charge of second-degree murder. To sweeten the deal, Ragan told detectives he would show them where he buried Bruce Kim's head. Wow, I forgot they found him with no head. Ragan had already been convicted of 3 felonies, making him a likely candidate to be, quote, bitched, a slang term used to describe a habitual criminal. If prosecutors could get Ragan convicted as a habitual criminal, he would be sentenced to life and would likely never be released. On April 18th, Ragan pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and led detectives to the head of Bruce Kim. Investigators considered themselves lucky to find the body, but it would have taken a miracle to find the head on their own. The lead detectives said it was, quote, buried in brush so thick a coyote wouldn't crawl through it, end quote. The head was located in dense blackberry bushes about 300 yards from the gravesite. Using dental records, the identity was confirmed to be that of Bruce Kim, that poor baby. Ragan told police that he had thrown Bruce's clothes from the car as he was driving along the lodging road. Backtracking the road, police found several pieces of his clothes. Ragan then explained the details of the killing to detectives. He claimed that they both left the party at the Lamecca apartments and went to Bruce's house. They were both extremely drunk. Why is a 13-year-old drunk? And Bruce swore at Ragan. I don't believe that. Which threw him into a rage. Ragan said he wrapped his hands around his neck and started to strangle the boy. Bruce was much smaller and younger than Ragan. Quote, I didn't realize I had killed him. I thought he was breathing. What? End quote. When Ragan finally released his grip, it was too late. Bruce was dead. You knew you killed that boy. Stop lying. You intentionally wanted to kill him, so told police he cut off his head at the gravesite to avoid identification. When asked why he cut off Bruce's genitals and where they were, oh my god, they didn't find the genitals either. Lord, this is too much. When they asked why he cut off Bruce's genitals and where they were, he had no recollection of it. He claimed to not remember anything about any additional mutilations, the slash marks, or the attempted dismemberments. Ragan insinuated that he must have blacked out that night because of the media attention in the centrally area. Okay, pause. First of all, that's kind of scary for people to just black out and just have no memory of what they did. Like, how do you kill somebody, cut off their body parts, and you don't remember doing any of that? Bruh. One evening, when driving back to the Lewis County Jail with the Centralia chief of police, they passed a familiar hamburger stand. Ragan laminated that he would probably never taste another milkshake for the rest of his life. Chief Jones was a firm believer that all men deserved some sense of dignity, regardless of what they may have done in their lives. He stopped by the drive-in and bought Ragan what was most likely his last milkshake. What about Bruce? Bruce couldn't have a milkshake, so why are you... What? That don't even make sense. Why would you do that? Jones' kindness eventually paid off. Okay, maybe he had a plan. A few days later, Ragan asked to speak to Chief Jones. Ragan said, quote, "It came down just like you had put it together. I trust you. I won't talk to anyone but you. There are some things I could clear up if I knew I wouldn't get prosecuted for it. I could clear the board some," end quote. In an extremely controversial move, Chief Jones spoke to prosecutors and asked to grant immunity for Ragan from any prosecution for crimes other than homicide or crimes out of his jurisdiction. The prosecution agreed. Ragan then admitted to setting the Lemick apartments on fire. On the evening of January 5th, just before midnight, Ragan was parked near the building. Quote, "It was so ugly, I just went back to burn it down because it was so ugly," end quote. He told police that he was drunk and simply wedged newspaper into the frame of the building and lit it ablaze. He also admitted to setting several fires in the area, including forest fires, buildings, and bridges with no regard for human life. He said he always just used newspapers in a match. He then confessed to several other burglaries, larcenies, assaults, and another rape, of a young boy. Ragan was found guilty of second-degree murder, being a habitual criminal, second-degree assault with a deadly weapon in the first degree, and 2 counts of sodomy. In an unprecedented move, the prosecutor tried him for the second habitual criminal charges, strictly to solidify the chance that he would never be released. Quote, "Under our present system of perpetual appeals and post-conviction writs, no conviction is 100% solid," end quote. Tommy Ragan was convicted of a total of 7 felonies in Washington and another burglary conviction in Alaska. What the hell was he doing in Alaska? As of this writing, 77-year-old Ragan is still held in the Monroe Correctional Complex in Monroe, Washington. His listed possible release date is July 17, so much. I had no idea that this had anything to do with a minor. So thank you again. If you enjoyed this type of content, don't forget to like, comment anything down below, and of course subscribe.